Hello, welcome. My name is Casey Lundgren. I am one of the ASL interpreters on staff here in the Disability Equity Office. The other staff interpreter, Casey Ann, is also here. She is interpreting this event. Thank you, Casey Ann. And thank you all for coming to our virtual NDEAM event on this beautiful fall day. Today, I'll be talking about this question that Casey Ann and I frequently get asked. Is sign language universal? All right. Along with ASL interpretation, we also have a CART captioner here. Thank you, Annette. If you would like captions or ASL interpreting, you can turn either on using the buttons on the bottom of your Zoom screen, as you see here in this screenshot. Please engage. We're all learning here. If you have any burning questions that would be better asked in the moment, please feel free to add them to the Q&A. We have someone monitoring the Q&A. Otherwise, I will leave time at the end of the presentation for any additional questions. All right, so back to this question. Is sign language universal? No, it is not. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you have now. Just kidding. There's a lot more to say on this topic. However, the answer is still no. Just as spoken languages developed around the world, sign languages also developed independently and uniquely from each other. There are estimated to be about 300 different sign languages. 300 sounds like a lot, but there are over 7,000 spoken languages. And since there are so many awesome and unique sign languages around the world, this is why we specify American Sign Language when we say ASL. Most sign languages are named for the area that they are prominently used. Agenda. So today I'll be talking about the history of sign language in North America and the history of American Sign Language. You may be thinking, isn't that the same thing? We will find out. Then I will talk about the history of deaf education in America, and sprinkled along will be bits of deaf culture. Finally, we'll wrap up with key takeaways, and as I mentioned, there will be time for questions at the end. All right, there's a lot to cover, so let's get started. American Sign Language wasn't the first sign language in North America. Before ASL, there were many Native American sign languages that developed naturally here. They are collectively called Hand Talk, or North American Indian Sign Language. North American Indian Sign Language is the umbrella term for all of the sign languages that we know of that were used in North America. This chart here shows the language family tree. On the left, you have the single square of North American Indian Sign Language. This is then broken down into 7 regions, which is the second column with the reddish-looking blocks. And then within each region, the language could have additional variation depending on the tribe, which is listed in the third column with the 16 green blocks. You may be like, wait, what? This is similar to English. English is broken up into regional variations as well. You have American English, Canadian English, British English, Australian English. And then within America, the English language can vary depending on where you live. The Midwest versus the South versus Boston, for some examples. Dr. Melanie McKay Cody, who is a Cherokee deaf linguist and cultural anthropologist from the University of Arizona, shout out to my old school, is the leading authority on Native American sign languages. With a grant from the National Science Foundation, she and her team are working to research, document, and preserve these endangered languages by creating video dictionaries, as well as categorizing the languages into their appropriate place on the language family tree. Dr. McKay Cody also made this map, which is a little bit more expansive than the previous slide, since it shows North America and South America, or a bit of Central America. I like this map because it's a bit easier to see where all the regional variations are. She informed me that they are in the process of creating a newer, more accurate map with all of their recent research, which will hopefully be published soon. So how old are these sign languages? Well, they are some of the oldest languages in North America. There are depictions of sign language in Native American rock carvings and paintings that date back 6,000 years. When the Spanish conquistadors, Cabeza de Vaca, and later Coronado, arrived in North America in the early 1500s, they both noted that the Native Americans they encountered used sign language. In fact, Coronado noted that sign language was so well understood by everyone, deaf and hearing, that there was no need for an interpreter. The reason so many people knew and understood sign language was because it was a part of the everyday culture. Sign language was used during special ceremonies, rituals, storytelling, hunting, warfare. And most importantly, it was the lingua franca, or common language, for trading among different tribes. There were between 300 and 500 spoken Native American languages in North America. But when they came together for trading or any type of gathering, they often used sign language to communicate because it was something they all understood. Isn't that incredible? That's why hand talk is sometimes noted as the first universal American language. Unfortunately, like many spoken native languages, many native sign languages have been lost. This was due to numerous factors such as colonization, language ideologies, the decimation of the Native American population from new diseases and warfare, forced removal from their homelands, and especially the effects of the Indian boarding schools, which systematically deprived Native children from learning their ancestral languages. There were a few individuals who realized these languages were disappearing and tried to document and revitalize them before it was too late. This most notably happened with Plains Indian Sign Language. If we look back at the map on the previous slide here, Plains Indian Sign Language is the darker pink region in the center. So several books were attempted in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of those authors even reached out to the Boy Scouts of America and successfully made his case that the Boy Scouts should all learn the useful, quote, Indian Sign Language, as he called it. For a while, these Indian Sign Language instructionals were published in the back of Boy Scout manuals. Amazingly, in 1930, the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, hosted a gathering of Native American leaders in an attempt to encourage the continued use of Plains Indian Sign Language. The department even sent a team to film the gathering, preserving the language in action. The footage is incredibly still available today. And here it is. This council gathering involves members from 13 different tribes who all spoke different languages. However, they all signed Plains Indian Sign Language. We're going to watch just a minute of it. This section, the clip that we're going to watch, is during the introductions. There is captioning and interpretation. It is weirdly delayed, so it'll take a second to show up. All right, let's see if I can figure out how to share my other screen. Just give me a second. Oh, why is this not working?
Hi, Casey. This is Erin speaking. We can see your screen. I think you just need to hit play.
Okay, I can't see it, so. Okay. Can you see it now, Erin?
Yep, looks great.
Okay.
They brought me here from the Flathead country, on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. I have never seen these people here before and cannot understand their language. But they are all my brothers. We are all the same race. These people all use different languages. They are all my people. We meet here for 3 days. I'm glad.
Wow. Let's see if I can get my other screen back now. All right, Aaron, can you see my PowerPoint again?
Yep, looks great, Casey.
Okay, thank you. All right. Wasn't that really cool? As I alluded to earlier, a few tribes have managed to hold on and pass on the knowledge of North American Indian Sign Language. In fact, if you watched the Super Bowl last year, you might have seen some Plains Indian Sign Language. Here on the right side of this screenshot is Colin Denny, a deaf member of the Navajo Nation. He's actually one of Dr. McKay Cody's research assistants and is working to document and preserve North American Indian Sign Language. He was selected to perform America the Beautiful alongside Babyface, who's pictured on the left. Colin decided to use a mix of American Sign Language and Plains Indian Sign Language in his rendition to honor and raise awareness of, as he said, this language that's always been here. The recording of his performance is on YouTube if you're interested in watching it. But wait, you say, this is all really fascinating. But what about ASL? All right, I'm getting there. It's a puzzle. This is one of the pieces. So now we've got North American Indian Sign Language here in the first corner. As you can see, there's a few more things that we need to uncover. So let's go to the next puzzle piece, which is Martha's Vineyard. All right, Martha's Vineyard is a small island located in what was then the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Several Puritan families from Kent, which is located in the southeastern part of England, migrated to Martha's Vineyard in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Apparently, Kent had quite a few people carrying around the recessive gene for deafness, and linguists hypothesized there was even an old Kent sign language in use there. In 1694, Jonathan Lumbert was the first deaf person known to move from Kent to Martha's Vineyard. He settled in a town called Chilmark with his hearing wife, and there they had 2 deaf children who were the first deaf children born on the island. About 15 years after he arrived, immigration virtually stopped, and the community began to grow. Martha's Vineyard was already isolated, but the town of Chilmark was even more so. Chilmark was located on the southern end of the island. It didn't have a port, and it was more than a day's travel over poor roads to the nearest town. As a result, town residents almost exclusively married each other. They married, had children, and the deaf gene just spread. In 1854, when the deaf population there peaked, about 1 in 25 people were deaf. Normally, the ratio is 1 in about every 6,000 people. In one especially concentrated section of Chilmark, they reported that 1 in every 4 people were deaf. That's amazing. Due to the high rate of deafness, Martha's Vineyard was frequently referred to as the place where everybody spoke sign. Both hearing and deaf individuals used what we now call Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, which was either a sign language that developed naturally there or was based off of the Old Kent Sign Language that theoretically had been brought over from England. While not a utopia, for the most part, deaf people there were included in almost all aspects of community and community life. Hearing people even realized how useful signing could be. They noted that it was easy to communicate at sea between fishing boats, and they also used it to converse in church without the priests knowing. So useful, right? However, not everyone born in Martha's Vineyard stayed in Martha's Vineyard. Several Martha's Vineyard residents traveled further inland and settled there. Altogether, these residents founded about 30 additional villages along the northeastern coast of the United States. And wouldn't you know it, 2 of those villages suddenly began to have an increased deaf population as well. Those 2 are Henniker, New Hampshire, which is the brown dot with the 2 next to it, and Sandy River Valley, Maine, which is the red dot with the 3 next to it. Both of these villages were smaller than Martha's Vineyard, and the sign languages there became extinct before any research could be done. So we're not sure if the sign languages from Henniker and Sandy River Valley were the exact same as Martha's Vineyard, or if they were dialects, or if they were something completely independent and separate. Martha's Vineyard on the map is identified by the purple dot with the 1. And then this pink blob that you see on the other side of the map, that represents the widest range of Plains Indian Sign Language. However, that range was when it was at its peak. At this time in history, all of the North American Indian Sign Languages were being suppressed and pushed farther and farther away. So I want you to take note of this area where there's really no documented sign language available. That's going to be important. All right, let's check on our puzzle. There we go. So now we've got North American Indian Sign Language. We've got Martha's Vineyard Sign Languages. And the question mark is, as I said, we don't know if Henniker and Sandy River Valley are a part of that language family, or if there's something separate. If they're separate, they're going to go in this number 3 other category on the bottom. Now, I realize that our puzzle is not yet complete. However, this is when the famous story of ASL begins. Let's meet our key players. Alice Cogswell, that's her in the drawing there, was born in 1805 in Hartford, Connecticut. She was born hearing, but at the age of 2, contracted what was called spotted fever, which we now call cerebral spinal meningitis. She survived, but the high fevers caused her to become deaf. Her father, Dr. Mason Cogswell, was a wealthy surgeon, and contrary to popular belief at the time, he believed that his deaf daughter could be educated. Unfortunately, no school for the deaf existed in America at that time. And if you remember the map on the previous slide, unless you were born in that triangle of villages or in a Native American tribe that still managed to be using sign language, there weren't really any language resources available. Alice and her family were out of luck. Well, one day, when Alice was 9, a man named Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, pictured here, was visiting his family, who happened to live next door to the Cogswells. Gallaudet looked outside and saw all of the children playing, except for one little girl who was off by herself, Alice Cogswell. Remember, Alice is now 9 years old and doesn't have any formal language. Gallaudet approached her and quickly realized she was deaf. Not knowing what to do, Gallaudet tried to communicate with her. He pointed to his hat, and then he wrote the letters H-A-T in the dirt. Alice quickly understood, and Gallaudet became inspired. He agreed with Dr. Cogswell that deaf people could be educated. Dr. Cogswell had heard there were schools for the deaf in Europe, but he was a well-established surgeon with a practice and a family to support, so he was unable to go investigate himself. However, Gallaudet was a brilliant recent graduate with no such ties, so Dr. Cogswell decided to pay Gallaudet to travel to Europe and learn how they taught deaf students there. Once Gallaudet learned their methods, he would come back, found a school, and teach Alice. Easy peasy, right? This brings us to our first trivia question. Aaron, if you can launch our Zoom poll. Now, this is just for fun. I haven't mentioned this yet, and I don't expect anyone to know the answer, but props if you do. Gallaudet travels to Europe. Where do you think he goes? And the options I have are Germany, France, England, and Italy. I still see answers coming in, so we're just going to wait just a second. And again, this is just for fun. You don't even have to answer if you don't want to. All right, I don't see any more. Don't see any more answers coming in, so. All right. Well, at least somebody picked Italy. That's nice. Seems like most people think he went to France and a few, and then it's split between Germany and England. All right. Let's, how do I get this? There we go. Okay, let's see. England. Wait, what? If you know the famous story of Gallaudet, he's famous for going to France, but he actually went to England first. Dr. Cogswell had heard there were several schools for the deaf there run by the Braidwood family. It was their best lead, so he sent Gallaudet to England. The Braidwoods focused on oral methods of instruction. Oral means that they didn't use sign language and were focused on teaching children to speak and lip read. Well, the Braidwoods did not want to share their secrets with Gallaudet, thank goodness, and demanded great sums of money before even engaging with Gallaudet, which he did not have. Their restrictions continued. If Gallaudet wanted to learn their prized methods, he had to agree to stay in England for 3 years, basically sign a non-disclosure agreement promising to never reveal their secrets. And then any school that he founded in America would have to pay dividends to the Braidwoods. Well, Gallaudet didn't have the money or 3 years, and he wasn't convinced that the oral method was the way to go. Fortunately, his trip was not in vain. In England, he happened to meet Abbé Sicard, who's pictured here. He was the head of the Royal Institute for Deaf Mutes in Paris. Abbé Sicard was traveling with 2 of their deaf faculty members, Laurent Claire and Jean Massieu. Claire and Massieu were both highly educated deaf graduates from the Parisian school, and Sicard was showcasing them at various lectures to promote their school and methods. After learning of Gallaudet's mission, they immediately invited him to accompany them back to their school and learn about their manual methods for teaching. Manual means using sign language. Gallaudet was already impressed with Sicard, Claire, and Massieu, but after seeing the school, he was sold. This was the way to do it. He immediately began learning the teaching methodology from Sicard and French Sign Language from Claire and Massieu. After 3 months, Gallaudet realized he would soon be out of money, and he was nowhere ready to open a school on his own. He asked Claire to accompany him back to America to help. Claire agreed under the condition that he would only stay a short time, just to get the school established, and then he would return to France. The 2 friends agreed and set sail for America. Over the 52-day voyage back to America, Gallaudet taught Claire English, while Claire continued to teach Gallaudet French Sign Language. Once in America, Claire and Gallaudet raised funds and established the Connecticut Asylum for the Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons in Hartford, Connecticut in 1817. Gallaudet became the principal, and Claire became the first teacher of the deaf in America. Alice was now 12 years old and still had no formal language. She, along with 6 other deaf children, were the first class admitted to the school. The school is still going strong today. They eventually changed their name to the American School for the Deaf, and they have a beautiful statue of Alice Cogswell out front to commemorate her. Claire, who's pictured here, never returns to France. 2 years after establishing the American School for the Deaf, he married one of the students, and together they had 6 children. Thank goodness he did stay, because he had a tremendous impact on deaf education in America. He not only taught in Hartford for 42 years, but he helped found 30 additional schools for the deaf in America. Many of his former students went on to teach and administrate at these schools, spreading his methods and sign language. He was also called to speak in front of Congress about deaf education, and he even advocated for the use of sign language with President James Monroe. His knowledge, expertise, and passion almost single-handedly built the foundation for deaf education in America. All right, I don't know if you've seen the Coneheads from Saturday Night Live. It was a skit where they were aliens pretending to be Americans, and whenever anyone asked where they were from, they would say, "We are from France." And that's what you often hear about ASL, is that it came from France. Well, it's true, Laurent Clerc brought French Sign Language to America. ASL is still considered to be a part of the French Sign Language family. Most notably, ASL uses one hand to spell the alphabet, just like French Sign Language. British Sign Language and all of the sign languages of that family use two hands to spell the alphabet. However, ASL has diverged so much that someone signing ASL cannot understand someone who's signing French Sign Language, and vice versa. There are still similarities, though. About 58% of ASL signs are similar to their old French counterparts. That sounds like a lot, but you can't really understand someone if you only understand every other word they're saying. Languages have to be 80% or more the same to be considered a dialect of each other. Examples of dialects are Australian English versus British English versus American English. Most of the words are the same, and we can usually understand each other even if some words or some grammar or pronunciations are slightly different. Okay, here is our completed puzzle. We've got North American Indian Sign Language, Martha's Vineyard Sign Languages, Other, and French Sign Language. All of these contributed to the development of ASL. So what is ASL? Well, at the American School for the Deaf, once it opened, word got out. Children from all over began to enroll. Lots of children from Martha's Vineyard, children from Henniker and Sandy River Valley, children from Native American families. Many of these children had their own established sign languages, but even children who came without language brought what are called home signs. Home signs are signs and gestures that they've invented and created at home to communicate with their families. That category would be put in the number 3 other category on our puzzle, along with possibly Henniker and Sandy River Valley, depending. But all of these sign languages and all of these signs and gestures heavily influenced the French Sign Language that Clerc brought. And the result was something new. And that wonderful language mixing, that's what became American Sign Language. Since it's called American Sign Language and it's used here in America, people often assume that it's based on English, or it's a version of English represented on the hands. That someone who understands ASL will automatically understand written English. But ASL was not based on English. Much of ASL was based on French Sign Language and therefore French grammar. But after that language mixing happened in Hartford, Connecticut, ASL is actually grammatically closer to Navajo, which is really cool and makes sense now with the history, right? So that is the history of sign language in America and the origins of American Sign Language. Well, what happened next? Like Clerc, Gallaudet also married one of his school's graduates. Her name was Sophia Fowler, and together they had 8 children. The youngest was named Edward Minor Gallaudet. He was born hearing, and in his father's footsteps, he followed, dedicating his life to deaf education. So here in this picture, that's a picture of Edward Minor. He was born February 5th, 1837. A few years after graduating high school, he began teaching at the American School for the Deaf while he continued his own college education. In 1856, Amos Kendall, a former postmaster general for 2 different administrations, who was also a wealthy businessman and philanthropist, donated 2 acres of his Northeast Washington, D.C. estate to establish a school and dormitories for 12 deaf and 6 blind students. A year later, when the school was completed, Amos Kendall convinced Congress to incorporate the school. Now that it was official, he reached out to Edward Minor Gallaudet and offered him the position of superintendent. Edward Minor, at 20 years old, accepted and moved to Washington, D.C. 7 years later, on April 8, 1864, at the urging of Edward Minor Gallaudet, Congress passed an act that allowed the Columbia Institution to confer degrees as an institute of higher education. This brings us to our second, this is it, this is the last one, I promise, the second Zoom poll. We'll see any of you history buffs if you can figure this out. The year is 1864. So which president signed that bill into law? I see lots of answers coming in. All right, I'm not seeing any more answers coming in. So we can go ahead and share. All right, seems like most people picked President Lincoln. Man, you guys are good. The answer is President Lincoln. President Lincoln. Oop. Okay. President Lincoln signed the charter for the university. They are very proud of that fact. The blind students were moved to the Maryland School for the Blind, and the institution became the first and only university for deaf and hard of hearing students in the world. Edward Minor Gallaudet became the first president of the university, and 3 years after, the first class graduated. Their degrees were signed by then U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant, which began a tradition where all diplomas from the university were signed by the presiding U.S. president. My diploma was signed by President Obama. That's very exciting. Edward Minor remained president of the university for 53 years and was a powerful advocate for deaf education during his time. He finally retired in 1910 and moved back to Hartford, Connecticut. In 1894, the name of the college was changed to Gallaudet College to honor his father, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. I know you might think after hearing this history, it would be named for Edward Minor, but don't worry. Edward Minor has 2 nice buildings named for him on campus, including this pictured here, a 35-room Victorian Gothic mansion, which was built for him in 1869. He and his family lived in it the entire time that he was president. The mansion is still in use today, and every president since has lived there. He also has this gigantic, beautiful statue that's on campus in the mall. But the school was named for his father. There's a famous statue of the moment where Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet meets Alice. That's right at the front of the entrance of the school. And not to be left out, one of the dormitories is named after Claire, and Claire also has a very nice bust in a courtyard on campus. But I would be remiss to give this presentation without mentioning the Milan Conference. In 1880, the first International Congress on Deaf Education met in Milan, Italy. This International Conference of Deaf Educators is now just called the Milan Conference. Out of 164 attendees from around the world, only one was deaf. His name was James Dennison, and he was from the United States. He attended the conference with Edward Minor Gallaudet, and they were 2 of the only supporters of sign language in attendance. At the conference, after brief discussions, these hearing policymakers decided that the oral method of education was superior to the manual method, and that sign language would be banned in schools in Europe and America. This ruling had devastating effects on the deaf community around the world. Generations struggled without language, without education, and without jobs. The effects of this ruling are still felt today as the deaf community continues to heal, advocate for their language, and build itself back up. In 2010, the 21st International Congress on Deaf Education met in Vancouver, Canada. There, they issued a formal apology and accepted the dangerous ramifications their ban had. They acknowledged that the ruling was discriminatory and a violation of basic human and constitutional rights. One interesting result of the Milan Conference was the emergence of Black ASL, or BASL. In 1877, as schools in the United States became segregated, so too were schools for the deaf segregated. White schools for the deaf were prioritized, and since oralism was now considered the quote unquote superior method, ASL was banned there. In schools where this oralism was enforced, deaf teachers were usually fired and replaced with hearing teachers who could teach speech and lip reading. There were many stories of students who were even physically punished for using ASL. However, Black schools for the deaf were often not prioritized, and therefore oralism was not as enforced. Left on their own, many of these schools continued to use ASL. As hearing policymakers sought to eradicate ASL and sign language around the world, Black communities in America became a safe haven for ASL. They preserved it and helped carry the linguistic torch through these difficult times. However, while these two communities were isolated from each other, the language changed. But hold that thought, we're going to come back to it. I want to mention something else first. The woman in the picture here is Louise B. Miller. She had 4 children, 3 deaf sons, and 1 hearing daughter. They lived in Washington, D.C., but due to segregation, if she wanted her boys to have an education, she had to send them far out of the district on her own expense. In 1852, she had had enough. She sued the D.C. Board of Education on behalf of her oldest son, Kenneth, and all of the other Black deaf children living in D.C. who were banned from attending the elementary school on Gallaudet campus. Later that year, after hearing arguments, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia agreed with her. They ruled that African American students could not be sent out of the district or any state to receive an education that their white counterparts could receive in district or in state. This ruling forced Gallaudet to construct a separate, segregated school for African American students on campus, which was called Kendall School Division II. This legal decision is also seen as a precursor to Brown v. Board of Education, which happened 2 years later. All right, so back to BASL. Despite the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, desegregation of the schools for the deaf was a slow process that finally took place in the 60s and 70s. The last school for the deaf to be integrated was in Louisiana in 1978. But then something unexpected happened. When they integrated all the students together, the deaf white and deaf Black students had a hard time understanding each other. As I had mentioned earlier, while the communities were in isolation, the language had changed. Interestingly, some scholars say that Black ASL aligns closer to the ASL that was used prior to the Milan Conference, since it didn't experience the same language disruption. In 2011, research was published proving that Black ASL is a dialect of ASL. On screen here is a picture of the cover of their groundbreaking work, The Hidden Treasure of Black ASL. Black ASL was shown to be a dialect, which means that it's at least 80% similar or more to ASL. However, linguistically, Black ASL differs from ASL in many ways. Some examples are that it has different signs for certain words. It typically uses a larger signing space, meaning their hands are more frequently farther away from the body. And it uses 2 hands for certain signs more often than ASL, which would use 1 hand for the same sign. Black ASL is still used today. It's found most prominently in the southern U.S. And Gallaudet recently founded the Center for Black Deaf Studies on their campus, which will continue to research and educate others about Black ASL, Black deaf history, and culture. Despite the attempts to eradicate sign language, Gallaudet University is still going strong. The campus has expanded over the years to include, as I just mentioned, an elementary school, but also a middle school and a high school to go along with the university. It's the heart of the deaf community around the world, and now, thanks in part to Louise B. Miller, open to all deaf students. In 1960, in a huge victory for sign language, linguist Dr. William C. Stokoe published proof that ASL is an official language. It is not pantomime, it's It's not just gestures. It is its own language, equal to spoken languages. Research into bilingualism and language acquisition have proven that learning ASL does not prevent a deaf child from learning English. In fact, it only helps. During his research, Dr. Stokoe devised one of the first attempts at a written form of ASL. It's called Stokoe notation. It's the one pictured here in the top right corner. It's mostly fallen out of use, but there are still some academic circles that use it. There is still no standardized written form of ASL. Pictured here are some of the other attempts at creating one. These are all various ways to sign the word for house. Some linguists argue that video recordings are the equivalent written form of ASL, which is interesting. And now that ASL is considered an official language, it is offered as a foreign language in many high schools and colleges. More and more people are learning this wonderful language. In 1988, there was another huge victory for the deaf community. In its 124-year history, Gallaudet had never had a deaf president. There were 4 presidential candidates that year. 3 of them were deaf. However, the board picked the only hearing candidate, Elizabeth Zinser, who, while a qualified administrator, did not know sign language and had never set foot on Gallaudet's campus. This ignited a week of intense protesting that is now called the Deaf President Now movement. Under pressure and media scrutiny, Zinser quickly resigned, and the board elected Dr. I. King Jordan, the first deaf president in Gallaudet's history. He was president for 18 years and a tireless advocate for not only the deaf community, but the disability community at large. He retired in 2006. Gallaudet has had a deaf president ever since. Pictured on screen here is Roberta J. Cordano, Gallaudet's current president. So before I wrap up this presentation, let's go back to this question again. Is sign language universal? It's not, but there is such a thing as international sign. International sign is not a full language, which is why it's not called International Sign Language. It's an intentionally created communication system that people do use and use successfully. Linguists are starting to classify it as a pidgin, which again means it's not a full language. It's a system that's used as a second language when people who don't speak the same language come together. You can think of Spanglish. Spanglish happens when native speakers of English come together with native speakers of Spanish, and neither knows the other's language. So they borrow and mix words to try and get their point across. But Spanglish itself isn't a language. This is the same type of situation. People who sign different languages are coming together and mixing and mashing their languages together to try and make something that everyone can follow. However, unlike Spanglish, the deaf community is trying to standardize it. In 1951, at the first World Deaf Congress, where they formed the World Federation of the Deaf, this is their logo on the screen, they discussed the need for creating a universal set of signs to communicate. This international sign, or gestuno, had a very limited vocabulary and was quite rudimentary. In 1973, almost 20 years later, the World Federation of the Deaf published a standardized vocabulary, and then 2 years later, a dictionary and instructional manual. The effort was a massive failure. The resulting language was incomprehensible to most deaf people. However, as the deaf community has become more global and more connected, the foundations of international sign took root, and gradually a more robust communication system has developed since then. They dropped the name gestuno, and it's now just called International Sign. It's a combination of gestures and signs from sign languages all over the world, but it is heavily influenced by signs from the Western world. It's used at most gatherings of international deaf people and has even been used at the UN. It's a separate language system that you have to learn. Deaf people don't just instantly understand it, but it is concept-based and designed to be easily understood by someone with knowledge of any sign language. There are people who specialize in international sign and work as international sign interpreters. So there kind of is a universal sign language, but it's not ASL. We've come full circle. All right, we're just about finished. To recap, there is no universal sign language, but there is a system called international sign that was intentionally created to be used at international gatherings. There are about 300 different sign languages all over the world. They develop naturally when the need arises, just like spoken languages. Sign language has been used in North America for over 6,000 years. American Sign Language is much more recent, and it is an official language. It's developed from a mixture of several other sign languages and is distinct from English. Like other languages, ASL has accents and dialects. Whew! All right, on that note, that is all I've got. Are there any questions?
Hey, Casey, this is Erin speaking. We do
Yes.
have a question for you.
Okay.
One of our attendees states that they've taken ASL classes in the past and they're taking an intro class with their child right now. They would love to find a group to help practice their ASL and converse with others open to those who want to learn. Are there any groups or resources you know of?
Casey Ann and I have compiled a list of resources for learning and practicing ASL, and we do have a section on our list that is in targeting children and speaking sign or using sign language with children. I'm happy to share that resource with you. If you can just send us an email, then we'll go ahead and send you that list, and we can let you know of all the resources we know in the area and that are available nationally. And hopefully you'll find something that can help. Because that's great. I'm excited to hear that.
Thank you, Casey. This is Erin again. We have another question. We have a user who is curious as to how finger spelling, which comes from English, fits into ASL.
Yes. So finger spelling, the Native American Sign Languages didn't have finger spelling because most of them didn't have a written component to their language. Some did develop written components later, but those sign languages developed without the concept of finger spelling. Finger spelling is definitely something that has come from languages that have a written component, and it's a way to convey those written words on the hands. So our finger spelling alphabet comes from the French Sign Language alphabet, and it is the influence of the spoken language on the sign language. So it is, for American Sign Language, it is the English part on the hands. And it was developed as a tool to help teach the English and the written English aspect of those languages. But now it's just an ingrained part of the language, and it's used so frequently. It's a part of that language mixing here in our American culture, where we have American Sign Language and English and written English all kind of happening at the same time. So there's a Spanglish aspect of mixing that happens, and that's where the finger spelling gets incorporated more and more often. People who are very bilingual will sometimes like to know the specific English word, and those people can sometimes, people who want to know the specific English words will like to see the finger spelling more often. That's kind of a long-winded explanation, but I hope that gives you a little bit of what you were asking for about how finger spelling is incorporated into ASL. It is an essential part of American Sign Language at this point. It is from the English influence.
Thank you, Casey. We have one more question.
Yes.
Do you know how big is the deaf community at Martha's Vineyard now?
Currently, I think there's nobody who speaks Martha's Vineyard Sign Language anymore. There was a documentary that was made maybe 10 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. I don't quite remember, but they did a documentary out there, and there was just like the last few senior citizens who remembered seeing Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. So at that point, it was even already, there was nobody that was like fluently really using it. But that's when researchers were really going out there to try and document it before it completely disappeared. And at this point, I don't think that there are any more native Martha's Vineyard Sign Language users that live there. They did manage to document quite a bit of the language, so it is hopefully like preserved, but I don't think anybody is there who still fluently signs it. I think they still teach the history. The history is still really important. Obviously, it's an important part of deaf history and deaf culture, so that history is still taught. And that Martha's Vineyard is very proud of it, that they were a part of that history, so they teach it there. But I don't think the language there has continued anymore, unfortunately.
Thank you, Casey. This is Erin speaking again. We don't have any other questions, but we have a lot of feedback about how much we've all learned and how great of a presentation this was. So thank you for that.
So great. You are so welcome. All right, the last few slides are here explaining our office and our upcoming events, our remaining NDEAM events, and how to get in touch with us if you need any of our services. And if there are no other questions, then I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And thanks so much for coming.